The Trump administration is turning to the Supreme Court over a federal judge's ruling on DACA. The Justice Department asked the Supreme Court to review a lower court's decision blocking the White House from ending the program. DACA protects nearly 800,000 people that came illegally to the United States as children.
So here with more on the Justice Department's request is CBS News Justice reporter Paula Reid. So Paula, what exactly is the Justice Department asking the Supreme Court to do?
Well, following the administration's decision to roll back DACA, there were numerous lawsuits that were filed. And earlier this month, a lower court judge in San Francisco, he ruled that he thinks the Dreamers are going to prevail after all this litigation is settled. And he said that while all this litigation is ongoing, that the administration has to continue to administer and enforce the promises that were made under DACA. Well, the Trump administration didn't like that, so they skipped over the appeals court. They went right to the Supreme Court, and they're asking them to settle this issue of whether or not they can roll back DACA once and for all.
So what are those potential outcomes if the Supreme Court takes the case, Paul?
Well, for the first question is, will they take the case? The Supreme Court has only really allowed folks to skip an appeals court about a dozen times over the last 100 years. But many of those cases were about presidential powers. So the first thing is the Supreme Court could say, hey, you missed a step. Go back to the Ninth Circuit. We know you don't do well there. We know you don't like them. We get that. But that's how the system works. But if the Supreme Court does allow them to skip over the Ninth Circuit, they will have to hear this case. They may hear this case, and they'd likely decide by the summer, and it could go a lot of different ways. Certainly, the administration could prevail on the argument that this is within the scope of the Department of Homeland Security's authority to roll this program back. Or the Supreme Court could argue that the program is valid. Congress will have to overturn it, or they could kind of split the difference. They could say, look, anyone who's already received any sort of relief under DACA, they get to keep it. But if the Trump administration wants to, they can roll it back going forward. So it'll be very interesting to see. It's very likely this will end up at the Supreme Court. It's just a question of how soon.
So can you explain the ruling that actually led to this request?
Exactly. So earlier this month, a judge didn't look at the overall issue of whether or not the administration can roll back DACA. He didn't assess their arguments about the fact that they believe they have the authority to roll back a program that the administration argues is essentially allowing people to violate federal law every single day. He didn't touch that. Instead, he said the administration, they need to continue to allow people who have received relief under DACA to continue to receive those protections. And they can't just roll this program back until there's ultimately a decision by the highest court that'll take the case on whether or not the administration has the authority to roll back promises that were made by the previous administration.
So this is what's fascinating about this is obviously DACA is a major issue on the Hill right now, and that may be the leading factor if the government shuts down tonight. Would that impact this case at all?
The government shutdown would not necessarily, but really what this does is if the Supreme Court does take this up, they probably won't hear it for a couple weeks, maybe months, and the decision likely wouldn't come until June, the summer. So it would buy time. It would give folks on the Hill about 6 months to try to work out some sort of compromise before the Supreme Court made a decision for them.
All right, Paula Reid for us in Washington, breaking it down as always. Thank you, Paula.